My parents bought an old house when I was 9. They loved the charm of the creaky wooden floors and the stained glass windows that caught the morning light. But to me, the house felt strange. It was too big, the ceilings too high, and there were too many places where the shadows lingered, even in daylight. The thing I hated most was the long hallway upstairs. It stretched from my room to the guest bedroom, lined with faded floral wallpaper and dim sconces that barely lit the way. The first time I saw him was late at night. I had gotten up to use the bathroom, which was at the far end of the hallway. As I stepped into the hall, I noticed a figure standing near the guest room door. He was a boy, around my age, with short hair and a plain white shirt. He was just standing there, staring at me. I froze, my heart racing. I blinked, and he was gone. Shaking it off as a trick of the shadows, I hurried to the bathroom and back to my room, pulling the covers over my head. I didn't tell my parents. I figured they'd just say it was my imagination. The next night I saw him again. This time he was closer, standing just a few feet away from my door. His expression was blank, but his eyes seemed too dark, like pools of ink. I whispered that he needed to leave, but he didn't move. I closed my eyes tightly, and when I opened them, he was gone again. The sightings became more frequent after that. Sometimes he'd be at the end of the hall, other times right outside my door. He never spoke, never moved, just stood there watching. I started avoiding the hallway as much as possible, sprinting to the bathroom and refusing to look toward the guest room. One day, I finally told my mom about him. She brushed it off, saying that old houses had a way of playing tricks on your mind. She told me that the dim lighting and creaky floors probably made my imagination run wild. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew the boy was real. A few weeks later, I found something strange in the guest room. My mom had asked me to bring in some towels, and as I set them on the dresser, I noticed a small toy soldier on the floor. It was made of tin, its paint chipped and worn. I didn't recognize it, and I knew it wasn't mine. I picked it up and brought it to my mom, but she said she had never seen it before. She shrugged and said maybe the previous owners had left it behind. That night, the boy was standing closer than ever, right in the middle of the hallway. He was holding something in his hand. It was the toy soldier. He stared at me, his dark eyes unblinking, and then he dropped the toy. It hit the floor with a small metallic clink, and he vanished. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I told my dad that I didn't want to live in the house anymore. He laughed, saying that we had just moved in and that I'd get used to it. I tried to believe him, but the boy's face was burned into my mind. A few nights later I woke up to a faint tapping sound. It was coming from the hallway. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and listened. The taps grew louder, more insistent, until they stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, staring at the doorknob, waiting for it to turn. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft and clear. It said my name. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I grabbed the covers and pulled them over my head, trembling until the first rays of sunlight peeked through my window. When I finally found the courage to open the door, the hallway was empty, but the toy soldier was sitting just outside my door, placed neatly in the middle of the floor. I didn't tell my parents what happened. I knew they wouldn't believe me. Instead, I started sleeping with my door locked and a flashlight by my bed. The boy still appeared sometimes, but I stopped looking for him. I'd feel his presence, the weight of his gaze, but I'd keep my eyes shut and wait for him to leave. One afternoon, while cleaning out the attic with my mom, I found an old photo album. The black and white pictures were yellowed with age, showing images of people who had lived in the house long before us. As I flipped through the pages, my breath caught. There he was, the boy from the hallway. He stood beside an older man, both of them unsmiling. I showed the photo to my mom, but she just said it was probably a distant relative of the previous owners. Later that night, I placed the toy soldier on the hallway floor, right where he had left it. I whispered that I didn't want to see him anymore, that he needed to stop scaring me. I stayed up all night listening for the taps, but they never came. The next morning, the toy soldier was gone. I never saw the boy again after that. The hallway still made me uneasy, but the oppressive feeling of being watched had lifted. Sometimes I think about the boy and wonder why he was there. Was he lonely? Was he trying to tell me something? I'll never know. But even now, years later, I still avoid long hallways at night, just in case I might see him standing there, waiting in the shadows. When I was a kid, my family moved into a 2-story Victorian house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The house was beautiful, with its wraparound porch, towering windows, and intricate woodwork, but there was one room that made my skin crawl. It was a small guest room on the second floor with heavy velvet curtains that always seemed to block out the light, no matter the time of day. At first, I avoided the room without thinking much about it. My parents said it would be the perfect place for guests, but we rarely had visitors. Most of the time, the room stayed closed, its door blending into the wallpaper like it wasn't even there. Then one day I went in. It was late in the afternoon, and the sun was casting golden light across the hallway. I opened the door, expecting to see the same warm glow filling the room. Instead, the space was dim, the velvet curtains drawn tightly shut. The air felt heavy, almost stifling, and the faint scent of lavender lingered in the corners. As I stepped inside, my eyes were drawn to the far corner of the room. There was an old armchair there, its fabric worn and faded, and in front of it a small table with a porcelain teacup sitting perfectly upright. It looked like someone had just been sitting there, even though I knew that was impossible. I told myself I was being silly, that it was just an old room with old furniture, but as I turned to leave, I thought I saw movement behind the curtains. I froze, staring at the heavy fabric, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Finally, I bolted, slamming the door shut behind me. That night, I asked my mom if anyone had ever stayed in the guest room. She said no, that it was too small and outdated to be comfortable. She mentioned that they planned to renovate it someday but hadn't gotten around to it yet. I didn't tell her what I'd seen. I didn't want her to think I was imagining things. Over the next few weeks, I tried to ignore the guest room. I didn't even glance at the door when I walked past. But sometimes, late at night, I'd hear faint creaking sounds from upstairs, like someone was walking around. Other times, I'd hear the soft rustling of fabric, as if the curtains were swaying in a breeze that shouldn't exist. One afternoon, when my parents were out, I decided to go back into the room. Armed with a flashlight, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air was just as heavy as before, and the curtains were still drawn. This time, though, I noticed something I hadn't before, a small picture frame sitting on the table next to the teacup. I picked it up and wiped away the layer of dust covering the glass. It was a photograph of a little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing a white dress with lace trim. Her dark hair was pulled back with a ribbon, and her expression was solemn, almost sad. There was no name or date on the frame, nothing to indicate who she was or why her photo was in that room. As I set the frame back down, I heard it, the faint sound of breathing. My heart jumped as I turned toward the curtains. They were completely still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind them, watching me. I called out, asking if anyone was there. My voice sounded small and shaky in the quiet room. No one answered, but the breathing didn't stop. It was slow and steady, coming from the corner near the window. I inched closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I told myself I had to look, that it was probably just my imagination. Reaching out, I grabbed the edge of the curtain and yanked it aside. There was nothing there. The window was closed, the sill coated in a thin layer of dust. I let out a shaky breath, feeling both relieved and foolish, but as I turned to leave, I froze. The teacup on the table had tipped over, its contents spilling onto the surface. The thing was, the cup had been empty. That night, I dreamed of the little girl in the photograph. She was sitting in the armchair, staring at me with those sad, dark eyes. She whispered something I couldn't hear, her lips moving soundlessly. When I woke up, the sound of breathing lingered in my ears. I avoided the guest room after that, refusing to go near it no matter how curious I felt. My parents noticed and asked if something was wrong, but I just said I didn't like the room. They didn't press me, but I could tell they thought I was being silly. One evening, my mom decided to clean out the guest room. She asked me to help her, but I made up an excuse and stayed in my room instead. I heard her moving around upstairs, the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor and drawers opening and closing. Then, suddenly, everything went quiet. A few minutes later, she came into my room, looking pale and shaken. She asked if I had put the photo frame on the bed. I told her no, that I hadn't been in the room since that day weeks ago. She didn't say anything else, just nodded and walked away. After that, the guest room stayed locked. My parents never mentioned it again, and I didn't ask. But sometimes, late at night, I'd hear the creaking of floorboards or the soft rustling of curtains. I'd close my eyes and pretend I didn't hear it, hoping that whatever was in that room would leave me alone. Years later, after we'd moved out, I found myself thinking about the house. I wondered about the little girl in the photograph, who she was and why she had been there. I thought about the teacup, the breathing, the curtains that never let the light in. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened in that room, but I know one thing for sure: some places are meant to stay locked, their secrets hidden behind heavy velvet curtains, and sometimes it's better not to pull them back. When I started volunteering at the local elementary school, I thought it would be an easy way to give back to the community. My job was simple: supervise the playground during recess and make sure the kids stayed safe. For the most part, it was uneventful. The children played tag, climbed on the jungle gym, or sat in small groups trading Pokemon cards. But then I noticed him. He always sat on the same bench just outside the main playground area, facing away from the other kids. He was small, maybe 6 or 7, with messy blonde hair and a faded blue hoodie. He never joined the games or talked to anyone, just sat there with his hands folded neatly in his lap, staring at the grass. One day I approached him, trying to strike up a conversation. I asked if he was okay and why he wasn't playing with the others. He said that he liked to watch instead of playing. His voice was soft and distant, like he was speaking to someone miles away. I asked him his name, and he said it was Liam. He added that he liked it on the bench because it was quieter there. I asked if he had any friends at school, and he said that he had friends, but they didn't play outside. I thought it was an odd response, but kids say strange things sometimes. For the next few weeks, Liam stayed on the bench every recess. I'd see him whispering to himself occasionally, though he'd stop whenever he noticed me watching. Sometimes I'd glance over and see him smiling faintly, as if he were sharing a joke with someone only he could see. I started to feel uneasy, but I told myself it was just my imagination. One afternoon I noticed something strange. The other kids were playing kickball, their voices loud and excited, but none of them ever seemed to look at Liam. It wasn't that they were ignoring him. It was like they didn't even see him sitting there. I asked one of the boys in the game if Liam ever played kickball, and he just gave me a confused look. He said that he didn't know anyone named Liam. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The kids weren't deliberately avoiding Liam, they acted as if he didn't exist. The next day, I asked one of the teachers if she knew him. She frowned and said that there wasn't a Liam in her class or any of the other classes. I decided to ask Liam directly. During recess, I sat on the bench beside him and asked why the other kids didn't seem to notice him. He said that it was because they didn't need to. I asked what he meant, and he said that they didn't know how to see him because he didn't go to school like they did. My stomach tightened. I asked where he went to school, and he just smiled and said that he used to go to school here, a long time ago. Before I could ask more, the bell rang and the kids ran back to their classrooms. Liam stayed on the bench watching me with that faint, unreadable smile. The next day I did some digging. I asked the principal if there had been a student named Liam who used to attend the school. She looked thoughtful for a moment before saying that there had been a boy named Liam who went there years ago. She said that he had passed away after an accident on the playground. Her voice softened as she explained that he'd fallen from the top of the jungle gym and hit his head. I felt a chill run through me as she added that the bench outside the playground had been placed there in his memory. That afternoon I approached the bench, my heart pounding. Liam was there, as always, but this time he looked different. His face was pale and his eyes seemed to shimmer faintly in the sunlight. I sat down and asked him why he was still here. He said that he liked the bench, that it was peaceful, and that he didn't feel so lonely there. I told him that I knew what had happened to him, that I knew about the accident. He nodded slowly and said that he remembered it too, but it didn't hurt anymore. I asked if there was anything I could do for him. He said that he didn't need anything, but that he liked it when I sat with him. He said it made the quiet less empty. I promised that I would sit with him whenever he needed company. Over the next few weeks, I spent every recess on the bench with Liam. I didn't tell anyone about him. Not the kids, not the teachers. It felt like a secret I had to keep, like breaking it would make him disappear forever. But one day he didn't show up. The bench was empty. The playground just as loud and chaotic as ever. But Liam wasn't there. I waited for him the next day and the day after that, but he never came back. I asked the principal if anything had happened to the bench, if maybe it had been moved or replaced, but she said that it was still the same bench it had always been. I don't know what happened to Liam. Maybe he found peace, or maybe he just moved on to another place. But sometimes when I pass by the school, I glance at the bench, half expecting to see a small boy in a blue hoodie, watching the grass and smiling faintly. And in those moments I like to think that he's still there, just beyond the edge of what I can see, waiting quietly for someone to notice him. When I was 10, my family moved into a modest 2-story house in a small town. It wasn't fancy, but it was comfortable, and it felt like home almost immediately. My room was on the 2nd floor, next to a small guest room that doubled as a storage space. I loved that room because it had a window that overlooked the backyard where my twin brother Evan and I spent hours playing. Evan and I were inseparable. Wherever one of us went, the other was sure to follow. We had our fair share of fights, as siblings do, but at the end of the day we were best friends. Our favorite game was hide and seek, and we played it constantly, whether inside the house or out in the yard. Evan always had a knack for finding the best hiding spots. Sometimes he'd stay so still and quiet that I'd give up searching and call for him to come out. One day, while playing hide and seek in the house, I couldn't find Evan anywhere. I checked all his usual hiding spots, the pantry, under the dining table, even behind the couch, but he was nowhere to be found. Finally, I called out that I was giving up, but there was no response. Frustrated, I yelled for him to stop messing around and come out. That's when I heard a faint tapping sound coming from upstairs. I followed the noise to the guest room. The door was slightly ajar, and the tapping grew louder as I approached. Pushing the door open, I found the room empty, except for the usual clutter of boxes and old furniture. The tapping, however, continued. It was coming from the closet. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something about the sound made my stomach churn, but I told myself it was just Evan trying to scare me. I flung the closet door open, expecting him to jump out and yell gotcha, but the closet was empty. The tapping stopped. Confused, I called out to him again, but this time I heard his voice behind me. He said that he was right here and asked what I was doing. I spun around and saw him standing in the doorway, looking at me with a puzzled expression. I asked where he had been, and he said he'd been hiding in the basement the whole time. I tried to explain the tapping noise, but he just laughed and said I was imagining things. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling the closet had given me. After that, strange things started happening. I'd catch glimpses of Evan in places he wasn't supposed to be. I'd see him standing at the top of the stairs when I knew he was outside playing, or I'd hear his voice calling my name from another room when he was right next to me. Whenever I confronted him about it, he'd look at me like I was crazy. One afternoon, I was in the backyard helping Evan build a fort out of old planks of wood. He went inside to grab some tools, leaving me alone. A few minutes later, I glanced up and saw him watching me from his bedroom window. I waved at him, but he didn't wave back. Instead, he just stood there, staring down at me with an expression I couldn't read. I called out, asking what he was doing, but he didn't respond. A moment later, I heard his voice behind me, asking who I was talking to. I turned and saw him standing there, holding a hammer and some nails. When I looked back at the window, it was empty. I told him what I'd seen, but he just shrugged and said I must have been imagining it. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I assumed it was Evan going to the bathroom, but when the footsteps stopped outside my door, I called out to him. He didn't answer. I got out of bed and opened the door, but the hallway was empty. The next morning, I asked him if he had been walking around during the night. He swore that he hadn't, saying he'd been asleep the whole time. I believed him, but the unease in my chest only grew stronger. Things escalated a few days later. Evan and I were playing video games in the living room when I heard his voice upstairs calling my name. It was loud and clear, unmistakable. I paused the game and looked at him, confused. He looked just as bewildered as I felt. He asked if I was messing with him, but I shook my head. The voice called out again, more insistent this time. We both ran upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice had come from the guest room. Pushing the door open, I saw the closet door swinging slightly, as if someone had just stepped inside. Evan grabbed my arm, his grip tight, and whispered that we should leave it alone. For the first time, he looked scared. We told our parents about what had been happening, but they chalked it up to our imaginations. They said that old houses made strange noises and that we were probably just spooking ourselves. They told us to stop playing in the guest room and to leave the closet alone. That night, I woke up to find Evan standing by my bed. He said that he heard someone calling his name from the hallway and that he was too scared to check it out alone. We crept into the hall together, clutching flashlights, and listened. The house was silent. As we turned to go back to our rooms, the tapping started again, coming from the guest room closet. Evan whispered that we should ignore it, but I couldn't. I told him to wait in the hall and stepped into the room. The air was cold, and the smell of dust was thick in my nose. The tapping grew louder as I approached the closet. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. For a moment, I thought it was empty. Then I saw him, a boy who looked exactly like Evan, down to the last detail. He stood in the shadows, his face blank and expressionless, his eyes dark and unblinking. He raised a hand and pointed at me, his lips curling into a faint, unnatural smile. I slammed the door shut and ran back to Evan, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward my room. We locked the door and stayed up all night, huddled together, too terrified to sleep. After that, we refused to go near the guest room. Our parents were annoyed, saying we were being ridiculous, but we didn't care. We knew what we'd seen. Years later, after we'd moved out of that house, Evan told me that he still dreamed about the boy in the closet. He said that sometimes, late at night, he'd wake up and feel like someone was standing at the foot of his bed, watching him. I told him I felt the same. I don't know who or what the boy was, but I know one thing for sure: he wasn't my brother. And sometimes I wonder if he's still in that closet, waiting for someone else to open the door. There was some